The conclave station hung in the darkness of space like a massive metal flower, its dozens of docking arms stretching outward to welcome ships from 100 different worlds. And at its center sat the grand chamber where the Galactic Assembly met to decide the fate of civilizations. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked through the gleaming corridors with her tablet tucked under her arm and a travel mug of cold coffee in her hand. And she did not look like someone about to face the most powerful warrior species in known space. She was 43 years old with gray streaks in her dark hair and tired lines around her eyes, and she wore a simple gray suit that looked almost shabby compared to the elaborate robes and armor that other species preferred for diplomatic functions. The humanity delegation consisted of exactly 3 people, and 2 of them were back on the ship handling communications, which meant Elena would sit alone at the small table assigned to Earth's representatives at the far edge of the chamber. 11 years, she thought as she entered the grand chamber and made her way past towering insectoid Drell and floating jellyfish like Yith, and dozens of other species she could barely name. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Assembly for 11 years, and in that time they had learned one very important lesson about the universe, which was that nobody out here cared about fairness or justice or the rights of younger species. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak learned to survive however they could. Elena found her seat and settled into it with a soft sigh, pulling out her tablet and beginning to scroll through logistics reports from the Oran Belt colonies, while the chamber filled with delegates from across the galaxy. The Oran Belt was the reason she was here today. 6 human mining colonies had been operating in that asteroid belt for 7 years, extracting rare minerals that Earth desperately needed for its expansion into space. And everything had been going fine until 3 months ago when the Kethvari Empire suddenly announced that the Oran Belt belonged to them. The Kethvari claimed their ancestors had marked the region as sacred territory 10,000 years ago, and they demanded that all human presence be removed immediately or face the consequences. Everyone in the galaxy knew what Kethvari consequences looked like, and the images of burned worlds and enslaved populations were not something Elena enjoyed thinking about. She took a sip of her cold coffee and continued reading her reports. The chamber's great doors suddenly swung open with a thunderous boom that made several delegates jump in their seats, and Elena did not look up from her tablet as the Kethvari delegation made their entrance. She could hear them, though, the heavy stamp of armored feet and the low, rumbling growls that passed for Kethvari greetings, and she could feel the way the air in the chamber changed as every other species turned to watch the warriors march in. The Kethvari were 8 feet tall on average, covered in dark green scales that could stop a knife blade, with 4 eyes that glowed like hot coals and mouths full of teeth designed for tearing flesh. They had conquered 40 star systems through pure military might, and they had never lost a war in their entire recorded history. At the head of their delegation walked Warlord Thyrak, the most decorated champion in the Kethvari Empire, a warrior who had killed over 100 enemies in single combat and led the conquest of 6 worlds. His armor was black and covered with the skulls of defeated opponents, and his ceremonial glaive hummed with the soft blue glow of a plasma edge that could cut through starship hull plating. Elena scrolled to the next page of her logistics report. The Kethvari delegation took their seats at the center of the chamber, in the place of honor reserved for elder species, and Thyrak remained standing as the assembly arbiter called the session to order. "We gather today to hear the grievance of the Kethvari Empire against the human territories," the arbiter announced, their voice echoing through the chamber's perfect acoustics. "Warlord Thyrak, you may speak." Thyrak stepped forward and raised his glaive above his head, and when he spoke his voice was like thunder rolling across mountains. "For 10,000 years, the Oran Belt has been sacred to my people," he declared. "Our ancestors marked it with their blood and their honor, and no lesser species has the right to defile it with their presence. Alina kept reading her report, making small notes in the margins about supply chain optimization. "The humans are children," Thyrak continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "They have been walking among the stars for less than a single Kethvari lifetime, and yet they dare to claim what belongs to the Empire." Several delegates from other species nodded in agreement, and a few made sounds that might have been laughter. "We demand the immediate removal of all human colonies from the Oran Belt," Thyrak announced. "We demand compensation for the resources they have stolen, and we demand a formal apology from their government for this insult to Kethvari honor." The chamber buzzed with whispered conversation as delegates discussed the demands among themselves, and most of them seemed to think the outcome was already decided. The humans would surrender, of course, because what choice did they have against the might of the Kethvari Empire? Alina received a message on her tablet from Earth Command, and she opened it to find exactly what she had expected. "No military support available," the message read. "Handle diplomatically, protect our people, do whatever you have to do." She closed the message and went back to her logistics reports. Thyrak noticed. The great warlord's 4 eyes narrowed as he watched the human ambassador sitting at her tiny table at the edge of the chamber, completely ignoring his speech and his presence and everything he represented. He had crushed civilizations beneath his heel, and this small, soft creature was reading reports. "Human," Thyrak called out, his voice cutting through the whispered conversations like a blade. "Do you have nothing to say in response to our demands?" Alina looked up from her tablet for the first time, and her expression was the kind of polite boredom that people usually reserve for waiting in line at government offices. "I am listening, Warlord," she said, her voice calm and quiet. "Please continue." "You are not listening," Thyrak growled. "You are playing with your device like a child who has been brought to an adult gathering and does not understand what is happening." "I can do both," Alina replied, and she looked back down at her tablet. The chamber fell completely silent, and even the Arbiter seemed frozen in shock at the casual dismissal. Thyrak's neck frills, the ones that Kethvari warriors raised when they were preparing for battle, began to spread outward like the hood of an angry cobra. No one had ever shown him such disrespect, and certainly no one from a species as weak and insignificant as humans. He looked at this small woman with her gray hair and her tired eyes and her shabby suit, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt insulted in a way that went beyond politics and territory and demands. This was personal now, and Thyrak knew exactly how to handle personal insults. Thyrak raised his glaive high above his head and let out a roar that shook the walls of the grand chamber, and every delegate in the room understood what was about to happen. "I invoke the right of Kethmer," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of warrior tradition. "Let this dispute be settled in the old way, through combat between champions." The assembly arbiter's many eyes blinked rapidly in surprise, and whispered conversations erupted throughout the chamber as delegates from dozens of species discussed this unexpected development. The right of Kethmer was ancient, older than the assembly itself, and it allowed any species to settle a dispute through single combat when diplomacy had failed. It was recognized by galactic law, and the results were binding on all parties. But it had not been invoked against a younger species in over 500 years, because it was considered deeply dishonorable to challenge someone who had no chance of winning. It was like challenging a child to a fight, and even the Kethvari had standards about such things. Or at least they used to have standards. "Warlord Thyrak," the Arbiter said carefully, "are you certain you wish to invoke the right against the human delegation?" "I am certain," Thyrak replied, and his burning eyes were fixed on Alina. "I will serve as the Kethvari champion myself, and I will teach these humans what happens when they insult the Empire." More whispers filled the chamber, and many delegates shook their heads or made sounds of disapproval. The Drell ambassador, a tall insectoid creature with mandibles that clicked when it spoke, leaned toward its neighbor and said what everyone was thinking. The humans will have to forfeit, it clicked. They have no warriors capable of facing a Kithvari in single combat, let alone Thyrak himself. The Yith delegate, a floating mass of luminescent tendrils, pulsed in agreement. It is a shame, the Yith said. The humans were interesting in their small way, but they should not have provoked the Empire. Alina continued reading her logistics report. The Arbiter turned toward the human delegation's table and spoke in a formal tone that carried clearly through the silent chamber. Ambassador Vasquez, the right of Kethmer has been invoked against your species, and you have one solar cycle to name a champion or surrender all claims to the disputed territory, along with the compensation and apology demanded by the Kethvari Empire. Alina looked up from her tablet again, and her expression had not changed at all. She still looked like someone waiting for a bus that was running slightly late. "I understand," she said, and then she did something that made every delegate in the chamber freeze in complete shock. She put her tablet on the table, took a slow sip of her cold coffee, and said in that same calm, quiet voice, "I accept the challenge, and I will serve as humanity's champion, and we can do this right now if you would like." The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the soft hum of the station's life support systems working in the walls. Thyrak's neck frills stopped spreading, and his 4 eyes blinked in confusion. And for a long moment he simply stared at the small human woman who had just volunteered to fight him to the death. "You," he said, and his voice was uncertain for the first time since he had entered the chamber, "you will be the champion." "Yes," Alina replied, and she still had not stood up from her chair. The silence broke as laughter erupted from several delegations around the chamber, and even some species who normally had trouble expressing emotions made sounds that clearly indicated amusement. The Drell ambassador's mandibles clicked rapidly in what passed for hysterical laughter among its kind. "The human has gone insane," it said to anyone who would listen. "The stress of facing the Kethvari has broken her mind." The Yith delegate's tendrils pulsed with patterns of confused entertainment. "Perhaps this is a human joke," it suggested. "They are known for their strange sense of humor." But Alina was not laughing, and she was not joking, and she sat in her chair with her hands folded on the table and waited for Thyrak to respond. The great warlord recovered from his shock and let out a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a growl of anger. "You dare mock me," he said, and his voice was dangerous now. "You dare make a joke of Kethvari traditions." "I am not mocking you," Alina replied. "I am accepting your challenge, which is my right under the right of Kethmer, and I am suggesting we proceed immediately rather than waiting a solar cycle." She tilted her head slightly, and her tired eyes met Thyrak's burning gaze. "Unless you would like to withdraw the challenge." The question hung in the air like a blade, and Thyrak understood immediately what she was doing. If he withdrew now, after invoking the right against an unarmed human woman who had not even bothered to stand up, he would look like a coward in front of the entire assembly. His honor would be destroyed, and the Kethvari Empire would become a laughingstock among the stars. But if he accepted, if he fought and killed this small, soft creature who clearly had no way to defend herself, he would look like a monster who murdered helpless opponents for sport. It was a trap, he realized, a clever trap made of words and honor and tradition. But Thyrak had not conquered 6 worlds by backing down from traps. "I accept," he said, and his voice was hard and cold. "Let the circle be drawn, and let the human face the consequences of her arrogance." The assembly arbiter gestured to the chamber's attendants, and they quickly cleared a large space in the center of the room, marking a perfect circle on the floor with glowing blue light. The combat circle was 20 meters across, and the rules of the rite were simple. Both champions would enter the circle, and only one would leave as the winner. The fight ended when one champion was dead, or unconscious, or surrendered, or was forced outside the circle's boundary. Thyrax stepped into the circle and took his position, his plasma-edged glaive humming with deadly energy, his scaled body coiled like a spring ready to unleash violence. He had killed 30 champions in circles just like this one, warriors from species that were far more dangerous than humans, and he had never once felt uncertain about the outcome. Until now. Because Elena Vasquez was wheeling her chair toward the circle's edge, and she was carrying her tablet in one hand and her travel mug in the other, and she still had not stood up. She stopped at the very edge of the glowing line and set her tablet on her lap and took another sip of her coffee. "Whenever you are ready, Warlord," she said. Thyrax stared at her, and his 4 eyes burned with confusion and anger and something else that he did not want to name. "Stand up," he demanded. "Face me properly." "I am facing you," Elena replied, and she gestured at the circle with her coffee mug. "I am inside the boundary, which is all the rite requires." She was right, Thyrax realized. The ancient rules said nothing about standing. "Draw your weapon," he growled. "I do not have a weapon," Elena said, and her voice was still calm and quiet and maddeningly polite. "The rite does not require me to have one." She was right about that too. Thyrax's grip on his glaive tightened until his scales creaked, and he looked at this small human woman sitting in her chair with her tablet and her coffee, and he felt something cold spreading through his chest. He did not know what she was doing, but he was beginning to suspect that he had made a terrible mistake. The grand chamber had become perfectly silent, and every delegate in the room was watching the combat circle with a mixture of horror and fascination. In the center of the circle stood Thyrax, the greatest warrior the Kethvari Empire had ever produced, his plasma-edged glaive humming with deadly energy, his massive scaled body ready to unleash violence that had destroyed armies. At the edge of the circle sat Elena Vasquez, a middle-aged human woman in a wrinkled gray suit, holding a tablet computer and a travel mug of cold coffee. She had not stood up. She had not drawn a weapon. She had not shown any fear at all. "Human," Thyrax said, and his voice echoed through the silent chamber, "you have one final chance to surrender with what little honor you have left." Elena looked up from her tablet and tilted her head slightly, as if she was considering his offer. "That is very generous of you," she said, "but I think I will stay." Thyrax's neck frills spread wide, and a sound like grinding rocks came from deep in his throat. "Then you choose death," he said. "Perhaps," Elena replied, and she set her coffee mug down on the arm of her chair. "But before you charge over here and cut me in half, which I assume is your plan, may I ask you a question?" Thyrax paused, his muscles tensed for the attack that would end this farce. "Speak," he growled. "Are you familiar with human military history?" The question was so unexpected that Thyrax's attack stance faltered, and several delegates in the chamber made sounds of confusion. "Your military history is irrelevant," Thyrax said. "Humans have never faced the Kethvari in battle." "That is true," Elena agreed. "But we have faced many enemies throughout our existence on our homeworld, and I think our history might interest you." She tapped something on her tablet, still speaking in that calm, quiet voice. "You see, Warlord, humans are not very impressive physically, and we knew this about ourselves from the very beginning of our existence as a species." Thyrax growled impatiently, but something made him hesitate, something in her voice that did not match her helpless appearance. "We had no scales to protect us," Elena continued. "No claws or fangs to fight with, no venom or natural armor, and we were surrounded by creatures that were stronger and faster and deadlier than us in every possible way." "And yet you survived," Thyrax said despite himself. "How?" Elena smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "We cheated," she said. Every single time in every single conflict we cheated. Because we learned very early that fair fights were for species that could afford to lose. She tapped her tablet again. We did not fight the mammoth with our bare hands, warlord, because the mammoth would have won. So instead we dug pits and filled them with sharpened sticks, and then we chased the mammoth until it fell in. Thyrek's eyes narrowed, and his grip on his glaive tightened. We did not fight the wolf pack face to face, because the wolves would have won. So instead we learned their hunting patterns and set traps and poisoned meat and attacked them while they slept. Cowardice, Thyrek spat. You describe cowardice. I describe survival, Elena replied. And it worked because the mammoths are gone and the wolves now sleep at our feet and call us master. She tapped her tablet one more time, and every display screen in the grand chamber suddenly flickered and changed. Where moments before they had shown the assembly's official symbols and agendas, they now showed something very different. They showed coordinates. Thousands of them. Scrolling across every screen in the chamber, each one accompanied by small details in human writing that most delegates could not read. But Thyrak could read them, because the Kethvari had studied human languages when they first decided to take the Oran Belt, and what he read made the cold feeling in his chest spread through his entire body. He saw the coordinates of his home fleet, currently stationed in orbit around Kethvari Prime. He saw the coordinates of his family's estate on the northern continent. He saw the coordinates of gaps in the orbital defense network, gaps that Kethvari military intelligence had considered classified at the highest level. He saw the location of the underground bunkers, where the Emperor's family sheltered during emergencies. He saw everything. What is this? Thyrak demanded, and his voice had lost some of its thunder. This is what I have been doing for the past 2 hours, Elena said. While you were giving your speech about honor and tradition and sacred territory, I was authorizing the deployment of 14 stealth drones that are currently sitting in your homeworld's thermosphere. She picked up her coffee and took a casual sip. They are very small drones, warlord, and very quiet, and your sensors have not detected them because human stealth technology is one area where we have invested quite heavily. Thyrak stood frozen in the center of the combat circle, his glaive still raised but his body no longer coiled for attack. You are lying, he said, but his voice was uncertain. I might be, Elena agreed. That is certainly possible, and if you would like to test the theory, you are welcome to strike me down and then return to Kethvari Prime to see what you find. She gestured at the screens with her tablet. Or you could try contacting your fleet right now and asking them to run a detailed sensor sweep of the upper atmosphere. But I should warn you that the Assembly's communication protocols will introduce a delay of several minutes, and a great deal can happen in several minutes. The chamber was completely silent now, and every delegate was staring at the screens or at Elena or at Thyrak, trying to understand what they were witnessing. This was not how duels were supposed to work. This was not how anything was supposed to work. Humans do not duel, Elena said, and her voice was harder now, less polite. We have never dueled, not once in our entire history, because we learned long ago that the concept of a fair fight is a luxury we cannot afford. She set her tablet down on her lap and folded her hands. We are what your scientists would call ambush predators, warlord, and we are very patient, and we plan for conflicts years before they happen. Thyrak's mind was racing, trying to find some way out of the trap that had closed around him. Those mining colonies you want us to leave, Elena continued. We have been building automated defense platforms in that asteroid belt for 3 years, not because we expected this specific conflict, but because we always expect conflict. 3 years, Thyrak repeated, and his voice was hollow. We knew someone would eventually want those resources, Elena said. We did not know it would be you specifically, but we knew someone would come, so we prepared. She looked at him with those tired eyes that suddenly did not seem tired at all. You see a diplomatic summit, warlord, and you think you arrived here with all the advantages. But humans do not see summits. We see battlefields, and we arrived at this battlefield 3 years before you did. Thyrak looked at the screens, at the coordinates scrolling past, at the tactical data that should have been impossible for humans to obtain. He looked at the small woman sitting in her chair, sipping cold coffee, and he realized that he had never been the predator in this room. He had been the prey from the moment he walked through the door. Thyrak stood in the center of the combat circle with his glaive still raised and his body frozen in place, and for the first time in his long and violent life, he did not know what to do. The screens around the grand chamber continued to display coordinates and tactical data, and the other delegates were whispering frantically among themselves, trying to understand what they were seeing. The Drell ambassador had stopped laughing. The Yith delegate's tendrils had gone dark with something that looked very much like fear. Elena Vasquez sat in her chair at the edge of the circle, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm and patient, like someone waiting for a slow student to understand a simple lesson. "Let me explain your situation clearly," she said, "because I think there may be some confusion." Thyrak's grip on his glaive tightened until his scales made cracking sounds, but he did not move. "If you strike me down right now, you will win this duel, and by the laws of the right of Kethmer, the Oran Belt will belong to the Kethvari Empire." She tilted her head slightly. "But approximately 6 minutes after you kill me, 14 drones will release their payloads into your atmosphere, and your homeworld will learn what happens when humans decide that peaceful coexistence is no longer possible." "You would destroy worlds over mining rights," Thyrak said, and his voice was rough with disbelief. "You would murder billions of innocent Kethvari over rocks and minerals." Elena was quiet for a moment, and something flickered in her tired eyes. "Would I?" she said. "That is an interesting question, warlord, and I have thought about it quite a lot." She picked up her coffee and stared into it as if it contained answers. "The truth is that I do not know, and you do not know, and that uncertainty is the entire point of this conversation." Thyrak's neck frills trembled with suppressed rage. "What do you mean?" "I mean that humans have never actually been in this situation before," Elena said. "We have never had the power to destroy an entire civilization with the push of a button, and we genuinely do not know what we would do if someone forced us to make that choice." She looked up at him with those eyes that seemed suddenly very old. "But here is what I do know, warlord, and I want you to listen very carefully." She set her coffee down and folded her hands again. "I know that my species has a very long history of doing terrible things to our enemies when we feel threatened, and I know that we have never once in our entire existence chosen mercy when we believed our survival was at stake." The chamber was absolutely silent now. "I know that we burned cities and poisoned wells and salted fields, and I know that we developed weapons capable of ending our own civilization, because we were afraid of each other." Elena's voice was quiet, but it carried through the chamber like a blade. "I know that we hunted species to extinction out of fear and convenience, and I know that we have never stopped building more powerful weapons even when we had enough to destroy everything we had ever built." She met Thyrak's burning eyes with her calm, tired gaze. "So when you ask me if I would destroy worlds over mining rights, my honest answer is that I genuinely do not know, but I think the better question is whether you want to find out." Thyrak's 4 eyes blinked slowly, and his massive chest rose and fell with each breath. He had conquered 6 worlds, and he had faced enemies who wielded terrible weapons and commanded vast armies, and he had never felt fear because he had always known that Kethvari strength would prevail. But this was different. This was not strength against strength or courage against courage. This was uncertainty against certainty, and Thyrak realized that he had always been certain before. He had been certain that he would win, certain that his enemies would fall, certain that honor and tradition and martial skill would determine the outcome of every conflict. Elena Vasquez was not offering him certainty. She was offering him a question that had no answer, and the question was whether humans were the kind of species that would destroy everything rather than surrender. "You are insane," Thyrax said, and his voice was almost a whisper. "Your entire species is insane." "Perhaps," Elena agreed. "Many of our own philosophers have suggested the same thing, but insanity and survival are not mutually exclusive, and we have survived for a very long time." She gestured at the screen, still displaying their endless coordinates. "The difference between humans and most other species, Warlord, is that we never assume we will win, and we never assume our enemies will be reasonable, and we always prepare for the worst possible outcome." "That is no way to live," Thyrax said. "It is the only way we know how to live," Elena replied, "and it has worked for us so far." She leaned back in her chair slightly, and some of the hardness left her voice. "But I did not come here today to destroy the Kethvari Empire, Warlord, and I do not actually want to harm your people." Thyrax's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Then what do you want?" "I want what I said in my opening statement 3 hours ago, which you probably did not hear because you were too busy planning your dramatic entrance." She picked up her tablet and scrolled through something. "I want a negotiated settlement that allows both our species to access the resources of the Oran Belt, with a profit-sharing agreement that recognizes Kethvari historical claims, while also compensating humanity for the infrastructure we have already built." Thyrax stared at her in disbelief. "You threatened to destroy my homeworld, and now you want to negotiate profit-sharing." "I did not threaten anything," Elena said. "I simply showed you the current tactical situation and asked you to consider your options." She gestured at the combat circle around them. "You are still welcome to strike me down if you believe that is the wise choice, and I will not try to stop you, because, as you have correctly observed, I have no way to defend myself physically." Her tired eyes met his burning gaze. "But I think we both know that would be a mistake, and I think we both know that there is a better path forward, and I am offering you the chance to take that path without losing your honor in front of the assembly." Thyrax's mind was spinning with calculations and possibilities, trying to find some angle that this human had not already considered. But every path he examined led to the same conclusion. If he killed her, he might trigger the destruction of his homeworld. If he surrendered, he would be disgraced, and his empire would be humiliated. If he simply stood here doing nothing, he would look weak and indecisive. The only option that did not lead to disaster was the one she was offering him. Negotiation. Profit-sharing. A face-saving compromise that would let both sides claim victory. "You planned this from the beginning," he said, "and it was not a question." "I planned for many possibilities," Elena replied. "This was one of them." She stood up for the first time since entering the chamber, and even standing she barely reached Thyrax's chest, but somehow she did not seem small anymore. "Sit down, Warlord," she said. "Let us talk like civilized species, and let us find a solution that does not require either of us to destroy what the other has built." She held out her hand in what Thyrax recognized as a human gesture of peace. "I will even let you frame it as a draw, so your honor remains intact." Thyrax looked at her hand, and he looked at the screens, and he looked at the glaive in his grip that suddenly seemed useless. Then, for the first time in his life, he lowered his weapon without victory. The negotiations lasted for 6 hours, and when they were finished, the Kethvari Empire and humanity had signed an agreement that gave both species access to the Oran Belt's resources. The agreement was not perfect, and both sides had to make compromises they did not like, but it was fair, and it was peaceful, and no one had died. Elena Vasquez packed her tablet and her empty travel mug, and walked out of the grand chamber without ceremony, her footsteps echoing in the silence that followed her departure. The other delegates watched her go, and none of them knew quite what to say. The Drell ambassador's mandibles clicked nervously as it turned to its neighbor. "Did that just happen?" it asked. "Did a human just defeat Thyrak without throwing a single punch?" The Yith delegate's tendrils pulsed with uncertain colors. "I do not think defeat is the right word," it said, "but I also do not think victory is the right word either." "What is the right word then?" The Yith was silent for a long moment. "I do not know," it finally admitted, "and I think that uncertainty is what frightens me the most." Across the chamber, representatives from a dozen species were having similar conversations, trying to understand what they had just witnessed and what it meant for the future of the galaxy. The humans had been part of the assembly for only 11 years, and in that time they had been dismissed as primitives and weaklings and newcomers who did not understand how the galaxy really worked. Nobody was dismissing them anymore. Within 3 days of the incident, the Drell Consortium quietly opened new trade negotiations with Earth, offering favorable terms for an alliance that had been unthinkable just a week before. The Yith Collective, which had been secretly planning to annex a human agricultural world on the Outer Rim, suddenly discovered errors in their territorial surveys that made the annexation legally questionable. The Vorn Federation sent a diplomatic mission to Earth to discuss mutual defense agreements. The Kreth Alliance proposed a joint research project on something called information warfare. And everywhere, in every corner of the galaxy, intelligence agencies began re-examining everything they thought they knew about humanity. The Kethvari Empire conducted a thorough sweep of their orbital space and found nothing: no drones, no weapons, no evidence that Elena Vasquez had been telling the truth about any of her claims. This did not comfort them, because the absence of evidence meant one of two things: either the human had been bluffing and there had never been any drones at all, or the drones had left before anyone could find them. And the Kithvari had no way of knowing which answer was correct. Warlord Thyrak returned to his homeworld a changed being, and the warriors who served under him noticed immediately that something was different. He was quieter now, more thoughtful, and he spent long hours in his private quarters studying human history and culture with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He watched recordings of human wars, and he read human philosophers and strategists, and he tried to understand the species that had humiliated him without even standing up. What he found did not comfort him. He found a species that had spent its entire existence fighting, not just against external enemies, but against itself, and a species that had developed weapons of unimaginable destruction, and then pointed those weapons at its own kind. He found a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and famines, not through strength or speed or natural advantages, but through sheer stubborn refusal to die. He found a species that had crawled out of caves and spread across its entire world, and then reached for the stars, driven by something that the Kithvari had no word for. The closest translation was a combination of curiosity and fear and ambition, and something else, something that made humans keep pushing forward even when every rational calculation said they should stop. On the night before he was scheduled to address the Imperial Council about the Oran Belt Agreement, Thyrak sat alone in his quarters and ran a facial analysis program on the recordings from the Grand Chamber. He had watched Elena Vasquez's face 100 times, looking for some sign of doubt or fear or uncertainty, some crack in her calm expression that would tell him she had been bluffing. The analysis came back the same every time. Subject displayed no physiological stress indicators, the program reported. Conclusion: either humans possess no fear response, or subject was certain of outcome before engagement began. Thyrak stared at those words for a long time. He had fought enemies who felt no fear, berserker species that charged into battle without regard for their own survival. And he had always defeated them because fearlessness without strategy was just another form of suicide. But Alina Vasquez had not been fearless. She had been calm, which was different. And her calmness came not from the absence of fear, but from certainty, the certainty that she had already won before the fight began. And that certainty terrified Thyrak more than any weapon ever had, because it meant that humans did not see conflict the way Kethvari did. They did not see battle as a test of strength or a contest of honor. They saw it as a problem to be solved, and they solved problems by thinking further ahead than their enemies and preparing for outcomes their enemies had not imagined. Thyrak thought about all the times he had dismissed humans as weak, and he wondered what else they had been preparing while he was not paying attention. He thought about the mining colonies in the Oran Belt that had been secretly building defense platforms for 3 years. He thought about the stealth drones that may or may not have been hovering in his atmosphere. He thought about the 11 years that humans had been part of the assembly, 11 years of being underestimated and ignored, and he wondered what they had been doing with all that time. The answer, he realized, was obvious. They had been watching. They had been learning. They had been preparing. For the first time in his warrior's life, Thyrak locked his cabin door before going to sleep. On Earth, Alina Vasquez returned to her small apartment and poured herself a glass of wine and sat down in her favorite chair by the window. Her tablet buzzed with messages from Earth Command congratulating her on the successful negotiation, and with requests for interviews from news agencies across the planet, and with invitations to speak at universities and think tanks about her experiences. She ignored all of them. Instead, she stared out the window at the city lights and thought about Thyrak's question. Would you destroy worlds over mining rights? She had told him that she did not know the answer, and that had been the truth. But there was another truth that she had not shared, a truth that she did not like to think about too often. The truth was that she had not been bluffing. The drones had been real, and the coordinates had been accurate, and if Thyrak had struck her down in that chamber, there would have been consequences that neither side could have taken back. She had authorized the deployment herself, knowing full well what it might mean, and she had done it because she believed it was necessary to protect the colonies and the people who lived there. She did not know if she would have given the order to fire. She hoped she would not have had to find out. But she knew that she had been willing to take that risk, willing to gamble with millions of lives on both sides, because the alternative was to let her people be conquered by a species that saw them as weak. And humans, whatever else they might be, were not weak. They were something much more dangerous than that. They were survivors. Alina finished her wine and went to bed, and she slept soundly despite everything that had happened, because she had learned long ago that guilt and doubt were luxuries that ambassadors could not afford. Tomorrow there would be more negotiations, more challenges, more species that underestimated humanity and had to be taught otherwise. But tonight she would rest, and she would not dream, because dreaming required imagination, and Alina had used all of her imagination on something far more important. She had used it to imagine all the ways the galaxy might try to destroy her people, and then she had made sure they were ready. That was what humans did. That was what humans had always done. And that was why, no matter how many times the universe tried to kill them, they kept refusing to die.